Hi, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the founder and CEO of Third Stage Consulting Group, and wanted to chat with you about how to deploy third-party SAP S4HANA quality assurance into your organization as you think about how you're going to begin your SAP S4HANA implementation, or perhaps you're already in the midst of your implementation and concerned about how to keep the project on track and how to identify risk and mitigate risk before they become too much of a challenge or an obstacle. Before I get started, I just want to share a little bit with you about Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent, technology agnostic ERP consulting and digital transformation firm. We help companies do four key things: digital strategy, which is helping clients select their technology solutions and also helping them define what their overall or overarching strategy is for their organization. We also help with implementation readiness, so helping in that gap between the time you've selected the software you want to deploy until your army of system integrators show up on site to your organization. What are the things that need to be done and should be done to ensure that you make the best use of those resources and time and budget? And then the third thing is implementation project quality assurance, which is obviously a key part of what we'll talk about here today. And then fourth is organizational change management. So the bottom two areas are really the key areas or the key components of what we'll talk about here. Organizational change is a heavy component or a significant component of the implementation project QA approach that we typically deploy with our clients. So when we look at why clients succeed and why some organizations fail, and it gets back to the story behind Third Stage. Third Stage is a rocket analogy. So typically you have multi-booster rockets that need multiple boosters to get to that ultimate height and speed they're trying to get to as they get into orbit. And the third stage is where obviously the ultimate height and orbit comes, but most organizations are pulled down by gravity in those first or second stages. First stage is when companies sometimes select software, but they get stuck with the overall implementation. Maybe you never even get through the implementation, and there's a great degree of turmoil. These are kind of those extreme failures that you often read about in the media. Most companies don't get stuck in that first stage, but a smaller subset of them do. Where most companies get stuck, though, is in that second stage. So this is where companies are able to complete their implementation, but they can't get the entire scope deployed. They have budget and time overruns, limited benefits realization and ROI, and operational disruption. So that's kind of what the average moderate failure looks like, or the moderate struggle to deploy SAP. And then only a small subset of organizations ever reach that third stage where they actually implement as expected, on time, on budget, they get the ROI they want, and they're able to be self-sufficient throughout the project after deployment. And so what we talk about here today as we look at project quality assurance and implementation, IV&V, whatever you want to call this whole framework, is to figure out how can we ensure that your organization gets to that third stage so that you're reaching that ultimate height and speed and level of success that you're looking for your organization, and making sure you don't get bogged down by some of the things that typically derail other projects. And so when we look at why SAP projects commonly fail, there's a list here of some of the top ones that we've seen in our experience helping with project recoveries, helping with expert witness cases where we're brought into a lawsuit to help opine on why the project failed, and then also in our own implementation experience and our own implementation QA experience. These are some of the patterns we see that differentiate the companies that succeed versus the ones that fail. And so when we think about implementation quality assurance on an SAP project, we're trying to figure out how can we avoid some of these challenges, and how can we identify these risks before they become too much of an issue, and how can we identify them early enough in the project to where we can make some sort of improvements to the project. And so when we look at the overall assessment and QA approach, it's pretty simple. I mean, starting at a high level here, we typically will either come in midstream to a project for a company that's already started their implementation. Oftentimes, probably equal amount of times, we'll come in from the very start to provide this QA framework. But wherever you are in the project, we can provide and deploy this type of framework. And the first thing we do is assess the project and look at where are we at right now. What are some of the analytical frameworks that we can deploy that we've seen work with SAP projects, as well as other types of ERP implementations too, by the way. A lot of what we talk about here is applicable to SAP, obviously, but it's also applicable to whether you're implementing Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics 365, Workday, NetSuite, Epicor, Infor, pick a software vendor, and this framework applies. So it's very technology agnostic, but we're focusing here today on SAP. And the second thing we do once we've assessed the project is we define the risk mitigation plan. So that's one of the first things we need to do is identify and prioritize the risks and then define how we're going to mitigate those strategies. And then what typically happens is we find that we need to recast and refine our implementation strategy and plan because typically something was wrong with that plan to begin with that led us to come in and find whatever risks we've identified in number 2. So we want to make sure that we're not only prioritizing risks, mitigating those risks, but also figuring out how can we recast and refine our plan to ensure that we avoid and mitigate those risks in a proactive basis going forward. So this is where we kind of shift from putting out the fires to how do we proactively get ahead of this now to address some of those risks that are creating problems for our project and our organization. And then finally, the fourth thing we do once we've done steps 1 through 3 is to execute whatever recommendations they are and help provide quality assurance and IV&V. For those of you in the government or government contracting space, you might be used to the term independent verification and validation, but it's the same approach, whatever label you want to put on it. And here's where we typically help be sort of an extension of our client's PMO to help provide the project management, the governance, the risk mitigation support on an ongoing basis. So what starts out as kind of an assessment and looking at everything that's happened to date and putting together a remediation plan and a mitigation plan, and then adjusting the overall plan. Then we kind of shift into more maintenance mode of ongoing day-to-day support to ensure that we're keeping the project on track so that we're not having to come back in a few weeks or months to come put out more fires. It just gives us an opportunity to get ahead of the curve there. And so when we look at that initial step that we talked about where we assess the organization, or we assess the project, I should say, we're looking at the project through a number of different lenses. And this is a high-level view of our framework for the different things we look at. And within each of these boxes, you see a few bullets here, but there's actually, within those bullets, even more bullets or sub-bullets underneath that. So this really understates the depth that we go into in analyzing SAP S4HANA projects. And what we do is we do sort of a health check here to figure out how do each of these areas rate on a scale of 1 to 10 based on where we are in the project. So in other words, we look at where you are in the project, what your timeline is, when your expected go-live date is, what would we expect to be done by that point in time, what things have been done, what hasn't been done, and not only checking off has it been done, but also has it been done well, and has it been done to what we would consider best practice or expected practice. So, what we might assess is, say, a red high-risk area at one point in a project might not be as urgent at other points in the project. So this framework is also based on time, and it's also based on the phase of a project we're in. But the whole idea here is that we're looking at the project from a very broad 360-degree view of what should be done here. And we're looking at everything from the overall project management, organization, PMO type stuff, like the project planning, the project governance and controls, making sure we've got procurement compliance with the contracts and the things that we expected to get from the software vendor and the SI. But we're also looking at the business side of things too, so process alignment and making sure we have that defined, benefits realization, reporting and analytics, and then some of the more technical things we look at as well. So things surrounding testing, master data management, configuration development, architecture. And then finally, and arguably most important, is the people side. So looking at organizational change management. What are some of the risks we're seeing and what are some of the challenges we're seeing, and how do we deploy a better organizational change management plan and strategy to address those risks? And quite frankly, when we go through this process, we typically find that organizational change is a huge area, and an area that is significantly lacking, and a lot of times the root cause of some symptoms we see through the project is because we didn't have good organizational change management to begin with. I'll give you an example. One of these boxes you see here in the upper right corner, second from the right, is configuration and development. So in here is where you might see some symptoms around too much customization. For whatever reason, we're getting a lot of customization requests. We're changing the software too much, trying to make it do things it was never built to do. And so on the surface, you might think, well, that's a technical issue. That's a project management issue. We don't have the right governance in place. It could be some of that stuff, but what we find oftentimes, more often than not, is that organizational change and lack thereof, organizational change, is the root cause of why we're receiving so many customization requests. So that's the type of analysis we do, is looking at not just what's the symptom, how do we put the fire out, but how do we get to that root cause of what's really driving some of those challenges. And so by doing this overall assessment and framework, what we're doing is we're getting to ensuring strategic alignment, we're assessing and mitigating risk, and we typically will offer our clients our third stage project certification to just provide validation and provide comfort knowing that we've certified this, we've assessed what the challenges are, what the remediation issues are, and as we get the project back on track, it provides a sort of confidence that you can provide to your executive team, your board of directors, your management team, whoever it may be. And so, in addition to looking at the project through these different lenses, we're also looking at implementation best practices and the things we would expect to see at certain points in a project. And here's a framework example that we would typically look for and expect early in a project. And I talked earlier about implementation readiness and how that's one of our 4 key offerings here at Third Stage. And this is a high-level view of that implementation readiness framework. And so when we're assessing projects from a QA perspective, a third-party QA perspective, we're coming in and looking at, were these things done and were they done well? Was it done effectively? And where are the risks and what are the things we can be doing to better achieve these things? So this is kind of our gap analysis, our perfect state, our suggested state, our best practice state of a project, whatever you want to call it. We're doing a gap analysis between that and what's actually happened on the project so far. If we're fortunate enough to come in early enough in a project where the implementation hasn't started yet, perhaps you've just selected SAP or made the decision to go with S4HANA, perhaps you've selected a system integrator, you've got those resources identified, then we can help assess gaps and identify risks well ahead of time, which is actually going to be a lot cheaper and more effective than if we have to come in midstream and try to course correct. Unfortunately, like I said, it's probably about a 50-50 split that we're seeing, where half the time we're being brought in midstream to try and course correct a project that's already well underway. In some cases, that's a little more difficult to change some things or to get it back on track. And then the other half of the time we're being brought in from the very start. And obviously, we'll help our clients wherever they are. We're not going to say no to someone who's already through the implementation, because we recognize that a lot of companies have trouble with their implementations. But the ones that have the foresight to see that, hey, we could use this third-party help and oversight is kind of an insurance policy, typically that ends up being a lot cheaper, faster, and more effective than the organizations that wait. So we also look at organizational change management. So these are the 15 areas in rough high-level work streams that we typically would expect to see within organizational change management. Within each of these boxes, there's obviously a lot of processes and templates and types of deliverables we'd expect to see. And a lot of times when we dig into this area too, we find a bunch of gaps. A lot of things maybe are being done pretty well. Companies typically are pretty good at things like the communications plan, getting change agents in place, identifying change impacts, but some of these other areas are less commonly addressed well. So what we're doing is we're identifying the health of each of these areas, we're identifying the risk, and just as importantly, or more importantly, we're identifying the risk mitigation strategies that should be in place for that. So that gives you a bit of a framework of how we typically tackle project QA for SAP S4HANA implementations. So I'd encourage you to reach out if you have questions about your project, or if you just want to bounce ideas off of me, you'd like an informal sounding board to talk about where you are in your project or where you think you're headed in your SAP S4HANA implementation. I've seen a ton of these in my career. Just in the last year here at Third Stage, we've seen several S4HANA implementations have been involved with either helping manage the implementation and or doing what we're talking about here, which is providing the quality assurance and the independent oversight of the project and the system integrator you're working with. So feel free to reach out. You can reach me on my phone number here, my email, Twitter, LinkedIn, and whatnot. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn as well. So hope you find this helpful and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much.